participants please mute themselves when not speaking in order to avoid any background noise or feedback when other participants are speaking. If a participant wishes to speak, can they please put their hand up if they can be seen on screen, or use the raise hand function. Please ensure that all debate is raised verbally and not via the chat function for the sake of recording. The chat function may be used to highlight any technical issues and/or to grab the attention of the chairman or Democratic Services officer. If any participant has difficulty hearing or being heard when they are addressing the committee, then they should let the chairman or Democratic officer know. If they have a webcam, then they should try turning this off, as this will help with broadband or Wi-Fi bandwidth, so they at least can be heard. They at least can hear and be heard. Thank you. So agenda item 1 is apologies for absence. Have we got any?
Chair, I've had one from Mrs. Gina Doyle, one of the tenant representatives.
Okay. Any others? No. Okay. Agenda item 2 is the minutes of the meeting held on the 15th of September 2021. Is everybody happy with the minutes?
Yes,
Happy.
Chair, happy to.
Okay, are we happy to accept them?
Yeah, happy to accept.
Okay, thank you. Agenda item 3 is to receive declarations of interest. Has anybody got anything they'd like to declare?
Not from me.
Okay, thank you. So agenda item 4 is the report of the Director of Environment and Housing. And this will be read. Oh, hang on, no. Yes, revenue and capital monitoring for the period 1st of April to 31st of August. Sorry, I was reading the wrong line then. And this will be presented by Laura Davis. If you'd like to go ahead, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Evening all. So revenue and capital position for the period April to August 2021. All revenue budgets are forecast to outturn on target, with the known exception of council fund housing, where the CCTV savings target cannot be achieved this year, as funding options are still being considered with the Police and Crimes Commissioner. Any shortfall will be met from reserves for this year for that service. But it should be mentioned, as I've previously mentioned, Welsh Government COVID funding has assisted several of these budgets in order to break even this year. So that has been a great help for these budgets. Modest efficiency targets shown in Appendix 1 for this committee are expected to be met in full by year end. And Appendix 2 of the report lists the capital programme for the committee, and there are 2 new additions, one of which is a £21,000 Welsh Government grant for target hardening, which is basically equipment for victims of domestic abuse to be able to stay in their own homes. So that's £21,000 to be spent by the end of March 2022. There is an additional £10,000 funding from revenue towards the Cosmiston and Barry Island disabled toilets schemes. So that's been increased on Appendix 2. And in addition, there are 4 schemes partly slipped on the Housing Improvement Programme. They're detailed in paragraphs 2.10 to 2.13. They're all for different reasons, but they're basically delayed, and the budgets of around 15 million will be slipped into next year, where the works will be continued and completed next year. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, I can see Councillor Hanks has her hand up. If you'd like to go ahead, please, Councillor Hanks.
Hi, thank you for that, Laura. I just wondered what was happening at Longmeadow. Maybe I should know, but could you just remind me what's happening in Longmeadow? And I was concerned that Homeview Phase 2, do you know when you've got a start date for that? And have the toilets been finished at Barry Island?
Hello. I can answer the Barry Island the question on the DFG toilets. I'm afraid it might be over to Mike for the other two. Yes, as far as I'm aware, the works have been completed on the toilets. Do you have a reason to think they wouldn't be, or is it just a general?
No, I've just been reading about it, and it was here, and I just thought they had been done, and I just wanted to know if they had been.
Yeah, I understand they
have
this
been
is the final
completed.
payment to go through. Yes.
Lovely, thank you.
Are you okay with the others, Mike?
Yeah, happy to come back on Longmeadow Court. The report indicates that bats have been sighted in the proximity of Longmeadow Court, and as a result of which a further survey was required. We're also required now to acquire a license in order to undertake works because of the presence of bats in the area. Works will commence this financial year, but as the report indicates, we're requiring some slippage now because works will not be completed in this financial year. So progress will start this year, but as I say, the programme has slipped a little. In terms of phase 2, we've yet to procure the works, and hence it's unlikely we would anticipate that we'll actually be on site in this financial year, and hence a requirement to slip that funding into next year.
Okay, thanks, Mike. It was just that phase 1 had gone so well, and that was that I thought that phase 2 was sort of more or less ready to go, but my misunderstanding. And going back to Longmeadow, could you just confirm what you're doing? Are you doing renovation work in part of it, or what were you doing in Longmeadow in Cowbridge?
So it's over £1 million worth of spend at Longmeadow. The majority of the work is external works. So what we will be doing is external wall insulation, roofing works, works to the environment outside of the complex. We'd already completed a significant amount of work in previous years through Welsh Housing Quality Standard requirements. So this will, in the main, focus on those external fabric improvements.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Sally. Councillor Aviott.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Laura. I just want to ask about the CCTV. Have we been getting value for money with the Bridgend, with the contract with Bridgend? Can you just let us know, please?
I'll take that, Laura, Chair. It's very hard to measure value for money. The difficulty with having a regional approach, which obviously you have one partner that is responsible for the monitoring, I suppose, and the difficulty with that has been operationally people having to travel to Bridgend in order to acquire footage, predominantly police officers, and the difficulty in Vale police officers having to travel into Bridgend. We also have issues, as members will be aware, in terms of the age of the current system, and that isn't necessarily a reflection on the contract with Bridgend. It's just a reflection on the fact that the existing system is well past its sell-by date, or elements of the system are certainly well past their sell-by date. In terms of value for money, the original decision to work with Bridgend and to adopt a partnership was around efficiency and value for money, and the £77,000 at the moment that the service cost was far less than it cost the local authority to maintain a Vale of Glamorgan service. So yes, it did derive value for money initially, but as I say, operationally it's becoming more difficult. What I would say, and on a positive note, is that the Police and Crime Commissioner has indicated in principle that they would support revenue funding monitoring of CCTV systems in the South Wales Police Force area, but where there was a number of criteria that are met, and the most important criterion that the PCC have been looking to adopt is a regional approach to CCTV. As members will probably be aware, most local authorities have their own CCTV services, and therefore the PCC and the police have indicated that they would potentially support bids to them for revenue funding where there was a regional approach. Officers have been working with Cardiff Council more recently over the last few months to explore that opportunity, looking at the technological issues that might throw up, but very much looking at a model which is adopted on the basis of hub and spoke. So you may well have a hub in regional centres across South Wales, but the local forces and the local PCs, the local authorities would be able to have access to footage within their areas without having to travel miles in order to see that footage. Those discussions are well advanced, and we are hopeful, clearly given our financial position, we're hopeful that we will have a positive decision on that, I would suggest, in the next couple of months.
Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Parker.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Mike, I actually visited it many years ago, and the cameras were old then. They're now very old. The big problem was a lot of them weren't working. Do we continue to monitor the number that are working? And although we say Bridgend, I think it was Pyle and Kenfig I drove to in the end, and it's a heck of a long drive.
In terms of, you're quite right, Councillor Parker, the technology and the equipment that the current system is predicated on is very, very old. We continue to repair and maintain through our contractor cameras where we can. We still monitor, I don't know off the top of my head today, for example, because it can change on a day-by-day basis in terms of which cameras are working and which ones aren't. So that has been an ongoing issue. I think it's important to point out that the council has committed a capital amount in excess of £300,000 within its capital programme to replace its camera stock, but that is on the basis that others take on the revenue commitment for the monitoring, which is the discussion we've been having with the PCC over the last 16 months. But as I say, there is, I think, light at the end of the tunnel in terms of those discussions, and an in principle indication that funding will be made available. What we've also been doing, and members will be aware, is that we have been purchasing deployable cameras. So where there are particular issues, either with the existing fixed cameras or where we have specific hotspots, because obviously, as we know, during the last 14 months, antisocial behaviour has been an issue in various areas across the Vale, which weren't covered by static cameras. We've been able to deploy those cameras where needed and to move them around, because as we know, ASB has a tendency to move from one area to another area when focus is placed on the initial area. So that's been really useful, and any solution that we do come forward with will be a mixture of fixed cameras and will be a mixture of redeployable cameras. And of course, we will be consulting with the relevant agencies and stakeholders with regard to those locations at the appropriate time.
Good. Many thanks, Michael. That's very clear. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think Mrs. Heather Smith would like to talk. If you'd like to go ahead, thank you.
Yeah, can I just bring back to 213 where it was on about phase 2 of the home view. It also says about the Colquitt Clinic and planning permission going in. We got the community centre and the parking situation coming straight out is dead across from the clinic. Have we got to apply for a different area for the gate to go if you're using that road? Because it's only one road, isn't it?
Yeah, so in terms of the scheme that we've developed, it will form the we will be demolishing the clinic as part of that. Off the top of my head, I don't have the plans to hand, but in terms of the access, it will be off that main road, that main road there.
Tennyson Road, is it?
That's right. And again, as I say, I don't have the plans to hand, but those plans will obviously cater for the needs of the community centre, the adjacent community centre. It won't affect, we won't be reducing the amount of available parking.
Well, they got their own parking anyway, it's just the way in and out is going to be affected, isn't it? Anyway, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Muted.
I keep forgetting to unmute myself. I can't believe this. Oh, okay, if nobody else has any more questions, then I think Laura is good to go. Thank you very much for your time this evening.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Sorry, Chair, just to check, in terms of recommendations, are we looking to happen to note the report?
I told you it'd have been a long day already. Okay, so are we happy to go with the recommendations?
Yeah, happy to
yes, happy, Chair.
Yes, yeah, happy.
Okay then. Okay, I will get my head straight in a minute.
Sorry, Chair, before we go on to the next item, just to make you aware that we have two new tenant representatives here tonight, Mrs. Vivian John and Mr. William Hennessy. Sorry, Chair, I should have said that at the beginning, but it's just to make you aware that they've come in to replace Mr. Raybould and Mrs. Davis.
Yes, I did notice that. I did notice that, but I forgot to say welcome at the beginning, so I was going to leave it to the end. But welcome and enjoy your time on this committee. It is an interesting thing to do, so I hope you enjoy it. Thank you for coming and giving up your time. Okay, so thank you, Laura. We've accepted the recommendations. You are free to leave if you wish. Thank you. Okay, so the next item is the Youth Offending Service 12-month performance report for the period April 2020 to March 2021, and this is presented by Paula Barnett. Before we start, Paula, I would just like to say I know this is your last meeting with us, so I want to say thank you very much for all your hard work, and I hope you enjoy the next steps in life. Thank you very much. If you'd like to go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. As noticed, this is the performance report for the Youth Offending Service for the period April 20 to March 2021. It brings to the attention of Scrutiny Committee the performance of the Youth Offending Service to enable you to have oversight of the service. It is important to note with this report that actually there is a delay in the data. Two of the national key performance indicators, a reduction in first-time entrance to the youth justice system and reduction of reoffending, were at the time the report was written unable to be updated because of a lack of accessibility to police national computers during the pandemic. So as part of our grant funding terms and conditions, the Youth Offending Service is required to report to the Youth Justice Board performance and indicators. The performance indicators we're reporting against today are first-time entrance to the youth justice system, and that is for the period January to December 2019. So you can see there is a lag in the data anyway. The performance reflects a 12.5% reduction in first-time entrance when comparing January to December 2018. This actually equates to a reduction of 3 children. The figures for 2019 show there were 25 children entering the cohort compared to 28 in 2018. So overall performance is positive. When we compare the performance to other areas, there's a 4% reduction across South Wales, a 1.7% reduction across Wales, and a reduction of 27.7% across the Yacht family. The Yacht family represents England and Wales. And I think it's important to note that England and Wales are at different stages in delivering the prevention agenda. As I said, there has been a decrease, but the rate per 100,000 for the Vale is actually higher than the Wales and the family averages, and that's due to the size of our 10 to 17 population. So because we have a smaller population, any increase or decrease makes a large impact on the rate per 100,000, and hopefully that's explained a little bit more in the appendices that provides more detailed information in relation to the report. As I mentioned, the performance data is supplied by the Ministry of Justice. It's extracted from the Police National Computer. We are not able to verify that data, so we're reliant on the YJB to validate it and confirm to us it's okay to publish. The next performance report indicator I want to talk about is reduction of reoffending. This shows a decrease in the binary rate, which is the number of children who are reoffending. So it's gone down from 27 reoffenders from a cohort of 59 to 21 reoffenders from a cohort of 51. When you compare April to March 2017-18 to April to March 2018-19, this indicator is always approximately 18 months behind, because they have to allow a 12-month tracking period and 6 months for anything to go through court. So it's quite out of date, the information, by the time you receive it. The percentage rate overall has decreased from 45.8% to 41.2%. And this is because there's been a reduction in the size of the cohort, a reduction in the number of reoffenders, and a reduction in the number of reoffences committed. Yeah, it's positive. In terms of the frequency rate, the number of reoffences committed by children who reoffend, again, this demonstrates a decrease. It actually went down from 135 offences to 53. So that figure relates to the average number of reoffences committed by children and young people. So when we look at the cohort of 21, they committed 53 offences, which equates to 2.52 reoffences per offender and 1.4 reoffences per reoffender. So the data presented is aggregated data. So it's produced on a quarterly basis. So if a child commits an offence in one quarter and then commits an offence in another quarter, it's accumulated. So they can be included 4 times in the 12 months offending, and the offending over 12 months can be counted 4 times. So that affects the percentages at the end of the period. We do actually produce local performance information in relation to reoffending because there is such a lag in relation to the YGB data. And we track a cohort of children and young people for a period from the 1st of January of each year to the 31st of March each year. The data for the reoffending measure is then tracked for 12 months. So we look at the first 3 months of the year, track for 12 months, and then we have the cohort at the beginning of April. The data demonstrates that 6 of the 23 young people who were tracked in that period have reoffended, committing a total of 13 offences. So this actually equates to a reoffending percentage of 26% when compared to the YJB's rate of 41.2%, with 2.16 reoffences per reoffender. We have included additional information in the appendices to show you the needs of the children that we're working with and some of the interventions we're delivering. I can see somebody's got their hand up. Did you want to ask a question, or did you want to wait till I finished?
I'll just wait till you finish, thanks.
Okay, no worries. So in terms of reducing the use of custody, during the 12-month period April 2020 to March 2021, we had no children subject to a custodial disposal. So again, that's positive performance. We then move on to engagement in education, training and employment. This indicator reflects the number of hours of education a child has been offered, alongside the number of hours the child attended the provision. So ideally, what that tries to show us is if there's issues identified with the performance due to a lack of provision or of a lack of attendance by the child. So the data provided by the YGP for the period April to March 2020-21 shows that we were offered an average 13.8 hours at the start of their intervention, 8.8 hours at review stage, and they ended on 7.5. Unfortunately, their attendance was less than that, at 11.3 hours at the start and 1.3 hours at the end. Both the hours offered and attended were less than the recommended 25 hours for children of school age. But it is worth noting that this period covers the pandemic, so mostly education was provided online. Young people of upper statutory school age were also offered and attended less than their 16 hours of provision. Again, their provision was impacted by the pandemic. We saw an average number of hours being attended at the start of 5.3, at review stage 7.1, and by the end 13.8, which is positive because there's been an increase, but it's still slightly less than the 16 hours of provision recommended. There is evidence during this period that we had a number of children engaging with the council's training courses that have been offered and being supported by Careers Wales and Inspire to Work. Access to a suitable accommodation. During the period March 2020 to 2021, we had 15 children and young people with a closed community penalty. 14 of them were in suitable accommodation at the start, with one child in unsuitable accommodation. He was offered a place in a hostel but chose not to stay there. At the end of the interventions, 14 children remained in stable accommodation, with one child, who was a different child to the start, being homeless. This is a result of 2 evictions following his behaviour and limited options then available through housing to be able to re-accommodate him. When we move on to looking at performance in relation to substance misuse difficulties, we can see that the majority of children and young people referred continue to engage in assessment and treatment. We had 15 young people during the period who required an assessment. 7 were already accessing services, so 8 were referred for assessment. 4 actually were assessed within the 5 working days target that we have. The remaining 4 were not assessed. 1 child refused to engage point blank. 2 were actually placed out of county before an assessment could be undertaken, and 1 child engaged outside the 5 working days. Following those assessments, we had 6 children requiring Tier 2 treatment and 1 requiring Tier 3 treatment, and they all accessed that within the 10 working days target period. If we move on to looking at mental health, we had 5 children and young people who were identified by the screening as requiring a mental health assessment, but all 5 were already accessing mental health services. We then have a local performance indicator, which is in relation to victim engagement. During the period, we had 94 interventions closing. There were 74 identified victims. They were offered access to restorative justice. 70 victims were offered access to restorative justice. Only 3 received direct reparation and 8 received indirect reparation. We have noticed that there's been a decline in victim engagement during the period. It is important to note that restorative justice is voluntary on the part of both the child and the victim. But we are noticing that because we were unable to offer face-to-face, that has seen a decline in the victim engagement. That could be because people are not happy about safety measures in place during the pandemic. We are exploring that further. So we're looking at our key performance indicator for victims and comparing it to the new Victims Code of Practice, which came out at the end of 2020, to see if we are measuring our engagement with victims accordingly. If we look at Q4, we had 11 victims who provided statements or views for out-of-court disposal meetings and reports, but they didn't want any further involvement, although they were happy to provide their views. If we measured that percentage, that would be a 73% engagement rate, but it's not actually currently measured at the moment. So we are re-looking at that measure. I would recommend the contents of the report to the committee, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Paula. I do have a question, but I can see Councillor Brooks and Councillor Aviett have their hands up, so I will let them go first. Councillor Brooks, if you'd like to go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Paula. You know, that's quite a comprehensive report there, but I think what concerns me particularly is how out of date an awful lot of that data is. Some of it was relevant to what's happening now and up to date, but I mean, it's so way out of date. I don't want to use the word meaningless because that's sort of, I don't want to decry the work that you're doing, but when you're trying to gauge what is actually happening and give it a true picture, it really is incredibly out of date. I mean, for instance, there was a report that came out today then about the rise of domestic violence within the home from young people throughout the pandemic. Now, you know, there's a definite rise there. Are there plans in place that we'll be able to get data a bit quicker and a little bit more relevant and up to date? Because obviously that report that came out today is very relevant. And obviously this doesn't reflect also all the delays in the courts, obviously because the delays around COVID. So it's how we're gonna, or how we can get some more up-to-date data really, and where we are in this position at time.
I think, to be honest, Councillor, it's quite a challenge because we're monitored by the Youth Justice Board, who's our overarching body. We get provided with grant funding to run our services by them. And as part of that conditions of grant, we have to provide performance information as set out by their data recording requirements. Because of the time it takes to track children over a 12-month period and going through the court system, there's always likely to be an 18-month delay, which is why we've tried to bring in local key performance indicators. But obviously, to be able to develop those, you have to invest time and effort in developing them to make sure you've got them right. And the challenge you then have is you can't compare them against anybody else because they might actually be recording in a slightly different way to how you're recording. So with the Youth Justice Board indicators, you can't compare other areas against yourself because we're all measuring in a consistent way. We are, as I said, we have looked at local performance indicators because from our point of view, and Mike will know this because he sits on our management board, having data that's 18 months out of date, you can't actually make any difference. So that's why we try to use the local performance indicators to try to be a bit more proactive in addressing some of the key issues that are emerging. Does that answer the question or not?
Yes, it does, and it's about sharing that frustration around this.
Yes,
There's no criticism of the work that your team is carrying out. It's just, you know, it would be so good, and obviously the further delays now because of the pandemic, as well. Yeah.
Well, we did have a situation in 2020 where the court was closed for 4 months. So we did have an initial delay. The court is now informing us that they're now back up to speed. So there are no delays as far as youth are concerned. That's not the same position as far as adults are concerned.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Paula. Mike Ingram, did you want to come in on that?
You're on mute.
You're muted, Mike.
Sorry, all. It was just to pick up on one of the points Councillor Brooks raised, and just to advise members, there's a report coming to your next Scrutiny Committee meeting in relation to the domestic abuse VODA SV response and action plan, and the issue of that the Councillor Brooks raises in relation to domestic abuse and violence within the home, especially from children, is actually highlighted in that report. So we'd obviously have an opportunity to discuss that report in further detail at next Scrutiny meeting.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Mike. Councillor Aviat, you are next, and then Councillor Perks.
Thank you, Chair. On page 23-24, Paula, I was just wondering, it's concerning direct and indirect restorative justice and direct and indirect reparation. Can you explain or give examples of that, please?
Yes, direct restorative justice is where the victim and the young person meet face to face. So that would be a restorative meeting where the offence is discussed, the reason why it was committed, and the impact on the victim and what the victim would like to repair the harm. When it comes to indirect, what tends to happen is the victim provides their views, so they're not actually directly present, And then for reparation, you'd be looking at reparation in the community. Direct reparation might be something the victim directly asks for. We would then risk assess it and be able to deliver that if it's appropriate to do so. If it's indirect reparation, it would be some sort of work that's undertaken in the community. So, for example, we've had some young people committing graffiti. So they've gone and washed that and painted over it and things.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Perks.
Thank you, Chair. And just to say to people who weren't here at the very before the start that my camera isn't working. That's why you can't see me at the moment. So apologies for that. I just wanted to ask Paula a couple of questions around the educational aspects of this. So I just wondered if any of the cohort are in mainstream school. Are they able to do that? Sort of what educational training, you know, if they're not in mainstream, what educational training sort of courses are available to them, or do they have to take part of the national curriculum? Are they expected to do that, or is it more what they actually want to do, if you know what I mean? You know, if they want to pursue a particular training course, say, you know, sort of they want to do mechanics or something like that, you know, are they able to do things like that? I just wondered what that was and why it tails off in the end. I understand, you know, that COVID, it was going to sort of tail off, but I wonder if that's normal for, you know, this particular, you know, not this cohort, but previous cohorts.
What I can tell you is that the two performance indicators, the statutory school age, that's all children who are school age, so under the age of 16, 17, depending on when they finish, they all should be in some sort of school provision. So
Okay.
They would be taking part of the national curriculum.
Yeah.
They may be in, I think it's called the Centre for Learning now, rather than the Pupil Referral Unit. So they may be in that provision, or they may be mainstream, or they may be in what's called educated other than at school. So they may be having a mixed blend of education based on whether they're doing vocational or academic qualifications. And then for post-16, which is linked to Careers Wales, Inspire to Work, Communities for Work, what they're actually doing is they're doing a lot of courses, providing them with skills, hopefully for employment. So, for example, they might be doing health and safety, construction courses, asbestos awareness, that type of thing. And some of the children who've been involved in those provisions have actually gone on to do some work on the 21st Century Schools programmes. So there's a range of provision. It's never enough, is what I would say, because some of the children we work with present some challenges, but there is a range of provision available to them. And when we talk about the learning tailing off towards the end, I think what's happened is we found, because the period of this report is that at some point there was not a lot of school. They didn't go back till September. So you've got some issues around the provision that was available at that point and re-engaging children back in school. We are working very closely with Learning and Skills at looking at children who've got reduced timetables and what pastoral support plans can be put in place to increase those.
Oh, thank you very much, Paula, for that answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul.
Sorry, you're muted, Chair.
You muted.
I did unmute myself. I must have double clicked and muted myself again. I do. Oh, I don't like this today. Oh, technology doesn't like me. Okay. Yeah, I do have one question myself, and again, it's regarding the restorative justice. I know with the pandemic that the uptake just wasn't there this year, really, because we were all being told to stay home, stay safe, don't mix with people outside of your household, outside of your bubble and everything like that. So it was a very, very small uptake on it today, this year, I should say. However, I'm trying to recall what levels of uptake were in years prior to the pandemic. Were they quite high or average or low?
Well, we pride ourselves in the Vale in being a restorative YOS. The Youth Justice Board used to measure restorative justice, and they had a percentage rate of 25% engagement in direct restorative approaches. We actually had in the Vale normally around 40%.
That's even better.
So we had quite a high level of engagement, to be honest with you. And we operate quite a lot of panels where there's opportunities for the victim to come and meet face-to-face direct with a young person who's committed the offence. As I said, unfortunately, because of the pandemic and the fact that we have to have risk assessments in place and we have to have buildings where we keep people 2 metres apart, it's presenting quite a challenge to be able to get a large number of people into a meeting room. We're hoping as the restrictions ease and things become a little bit easier, that'll be able to go back to how it was. And that's why we're looking at larger venues now to hopefully take that forward.
Good. Yeah, it would be really good if we could get it back to those levels, but again, it has to be done within the guidelines that we have at the moment, and we have to obey. Eventually, one day these restrictions will all disappear, but it might be a while yet. Anyway, well done, thank you. Councillor Nugent-Finn.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for being late, everybody. I did put it in the chat. I'm here now. Thank you. Thank you, Paula, for a fantastic presentation. And yeah, our loss. And I hoping sincere wishes wherever you're going. I'm kind of hoping you're retiring.
I am.
Oh, well, there you are. That was with the most sincere, wishes. So yeah, good for you. But before you go, I want to pick up on a couple of things. A couple of councillors have sort of started tonight, but the first one is regards to the vocational training and sort of the alternative curriculum and stuff like that. But there's a junior apprentice team, isn't there, or course in conjunction with further education. I believe we use that here in the Vale of Glamorgan. What sort of uptake have we got of that, Paula? Do you know?
Off the top of my head, no, I wouldn't know, to be honest with you.
Okay, no worries. I mean, it's worthwhile because it's for all the reasons to explain about the how we not so much failed, but things that have not worked, various interventions. So there is this scheme which is attached to FE, and it comes directly as a referral from the PRU. And I'm just interested to find out, how many are taking this up. If you could, maybe pass it on to to next in line, that'd be really helpful. You talked about 5 children accessing mental health support. Out of how many, Paula? Because that seems like a very low number given the timescales at the minute I'm dealing with CAMS and stuff like that. I sit on the CHC and obviously I've worked with Rose Whittle and I'm aware that there's a huge demand for this service, but statistically is that
what you've got to remember is this is in the cohort in the youth justice system. So when we talk about 5 children being screened as needing the access to mental health services, that's in the cohort that we were working with during the period.
Yeah. So how many would be in that cohort?
That's a question I'd have to go back and look at overall, to be honest.
Okay, no problem. And you mentioned there's issues with tracking. What are the issues, Paula?
The issues with tracking for reoffending, or
yeah, and it was linking into it's difficult for you to do the comparisons against other areas.
Oh, when we talk about the performance indicators, yeah, because the YJB data is out of date. Right. I think the council was asking, could we have something more local and relevant, and more closer to the time period? The difficulty would be is if we introduced our own local performance indicator, which we have, we can't compare it to South Wales, or our family yacht because they might not be measuring the same way as we are.
Yeah, I totally understand that, which sort of really poses the question, do we need to do a comparison? Should we be working more on a local level with outcomes, which are working? That's another huge...
That's a big, that's a large debate.
Yeah, it is, but food for thought, isn't it? And there's a escalation of violence within the home now from young people, with some really seriously worrying, threatening behaviour for all the reasons I completely understand. That's not a judgmental statement in any way, shape or form. But again, in terms of strategy and intervention, and this is going to come across the board again, but is it on our radar, Paula? Are we strategising how we're going to cope with it? Uptake of referrals, working with the domestic violence teams, etc. How are we coping with all of that?
Well, all YOS practitioners have been trained in respect training, so they can do some work direct themselves. I have to say, normally we would be looking to refer out to specialist organisations
Yeah.
to deliver some of that training, because some of it can be quite long-term work
Yeah.
that needs to take place. Unfortunately, there are not a volume of agencies out there delivering the programme of work, to be honest with you. It is something that's been highlighted and was highlighted by HMIP Inspectorate of Probation as well in their report about the number of children. We are working with some third sector organisations, but as I mentioned earlier, you know, there are never quite enough services. And I think there's an issue around perhaps early intervention and prevention as well.
Yeah,
because
totally agree.
by the time they come to us, they're already involved in those patterns of behaviour.
Absolutely.
But if they're not getting support when they've witnessed it earlier, you might be able to prevent that.
Absolutely.
And that's where we could do with more services, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, totally agree with you. And this has been spotlighted because of lockdown. So, you know, again, it's another manifestation of you know, how we're all dealing with it. It's very worrying, isn't it? Lastly, on a nicer note, have you heard of blue light discos? And is that anything we could possibly begin to put on here in the Vale of Glamorgan?
No is the answer, but then I would thought that would be picked up by the youth service if it's blue light discos.
It's in conjunction with the police, Paula, and it's again it's not about it's about forming very good established relationships, but the police actually run the discos or youth centres or youth clubs, just as we're coming out of obviously all the previous lockdown measurements and social distancing. And, you know, we've got the COVID passports now and everything else. It'd just be something I would be absolutely delighted to be involved in the Vale of Glamorgan. Just again, food for thought. I just wondered if you knew about it or any of the members really.
It's not been highlighted to ourselves.
Okay.
But then that doesn't mean to say it's not been highlighted elsewhere in the Vale of Glamorgan.
Okay. I'll speak to youth services. Thank you, Paula.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Councillor Nugent-Finn. Councillor Perks, if you'd like to come in.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to pick up upon something that Councillor Nugent-Finn talked about. I just wondered, Paula, at one time, I think the youth offending service had some in-house staff that actually went and spoke to parents who were having trouble with their children and stuff like that. I wondered if that's still available, you know, sort of that service, or whether it is goes out of.
No, we have. Sorry, we have a family support officer. So so children who are referred in to us, parents also have an opportunity to meet with that parenting officer, and an assessment's undertaken to identify if they've got any needs and any support needs. The Vale of Glamorgan also has a parenting service which offers wider parenting support to parents who are not involved with the youth offending service.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wondered whether it was still operating. I know it was
a few
years ago. That's fantastic. It does a really good services, provides a really good service as well. So thank you for that, Paula.
Okay. As long as nobody else has any more questions. Oh, Councillor Perks, could you lower your hand? Oh, you just did. Thank you. As long as nobody has any more questions, the recommendation on this is that we consider the contents of the performance report. Are we happy to say that this has been considered and we accept it?
Yeah.
Yes. Accept. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Happy
Gender
retirement, Paula.
Thank you.
Retirement.
She's
I'm
not
going to
going
spend
just yet. She's got one more item, the Youth Offending Justice Plan. Item 6, the Youth Offending Service Youth Justice Plan, updated July 2021.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So, as I said, this is the Youth Offending Service Youth Justice Plan. It is updated as at the July 2021, and that's because it needs to go through the YOS Management Board before it goes anywhere else for them to approve. So this report brings to your attention the plan for the 3-year period, which incorporates the improvements required following our Youth Justice National Standards baseline audit. It also highlights how the Youth Offending Service, as a key public service, will continue to deliver services as we recover from the pandemic, and enables you to have oversight of our performance. So during 2020, you might recall, the YOS was required to produce a transitions and recovery plan instead of the Youth Justice Plan, and we presented that to committee on the 11th of November 2020. In March 2021, the Youth Justice Board awarded us funding and advised that they were reverting back to an expectation to produce a Youth Justice Plan for 2021-22 in line with their practice guidance. Their practice guidance suggests the Youth Justice Plan needs to include an introduction, vision and strategy, governance, leadership and partnership arrangements, resources and services, performance and priorities, responding to the pandemic and how we're going to recover from COVID, as well as the challenges, risks and issues. And on top of all that, to outline our business and improvement plan. So we produced the Youth Justice Plan, which is attached to Appendix 1 for you. Also attached are the YOS structure, the budget breakdown for 21-22, and an infographic demonstrating the complexities of the children involved in the YOS cohort. So you will notice that the plan incorporates into a single document the improvements required as on the back of our National Standards Baseline Audit. It also includes recommendations from a Cardiff YOS inspection benchmarking exercise that we undertook, actions identified from the YOS Transitions and Recovery Plan of 2020, and recommendations from the HMIP Inspectorate of Probation reports published in November 2020. As I mentioned, the plan does span 3 years, and that's to allow us sufficient time to make the improvements that are required. It's split into a number of sections. The introductory section, which ranges from page 1 to 14, sets out our service description, the corporate landscape within which we sit, governance and structure, future challenges and collaborations, resources and value for money, partnership arrangements and risk to future delivery. Section 1 then, which is pages 15 to 22, sets out our cross-cutting objectives, and that's about our financial management, people management, sustainability and equalities. Section 2 is our operational part of the plan and goes from pages 23 to 62, and that demonstrates how we will deliver services to meet our key performance targets and the improvements we've identified. And pages 63 to 70 outline the governance, leadership and partnership arrangements, which focuses on how the strategic partnership supports the delivery of services to hopefully achieve positive outcomes for children and young people. In addition to all that, we have to demonstrate how we achieve value for money and that we're using all the money the Youth Justice Board gives us to deliver youth justice services. And it also includes performance information, which is the requirement of the data recording guidance. So you'll notice within the plan that there have been some updates of some of the progress that have been made, but there's been also some delay in relation to achieving some of the performance improvements we want to make due to capacity issues, I should say, experienced by the service throughout 2021. And that has impacted on our ability to complete a range of actions. And those capacity issues, unfortunately, will carry on for a period of time. One, because I'm retiring, and we've had some other vacancies within the service. So the recommendation is that committee notes the contents of the report, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, do we have any questions? I see no hands up. Okay, I think everybody is happy with that, as there are no questions, but just to make sure, are we happy? The recommendation is that the Scrutiny Committee considers the contents of the report. Are we happy with that?
Happy to accept the recommendation.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, once more, good luck, Paula. Thank you very much for everything. And you enjoy your retirement is well deserved.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Feel free to leave
members.
or stick around, whichever you prefer. Okay.
Thank you for your support. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, so agenda item 7 is the Homelessness Prevention Strategy 2018 to 2021, 22, I should say. And this is being taken by Mike Ingram. If you'd like to go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Members will be aware that they've seen this report previously. It's an update in terms of the action plan. The Housing Wales Act placed a requirement on us to develop a homelessness strategy. The Homeless Prevention Strategy and Plan were adopted by Cabinet in June 2019 and covers the period 2018 to 2022. The report also outlines the significant ongoing pressure to our service at the moment, resulting from the pandemic and following on from that and our recovery actions. I won't go through the background of the report, but in terms of the key issues for consideration, members will be aware that there are 4 themes to the plan: to provide robust and targeted prevention service, to develop and extend early housing advice and assistance, support people into integration within the community, and to support private landlords to improve tenancy sustainability. But ultimately, the overall aim of the strategy, as we all know, is to prevent homelessness at the earliest opportunity. Despite the challenges that the pandemic has presented to us, progress has continued, as you can see in the action plan, which is attached at Appendix 1. And apart from 3 of the actions there, we're on course to complete the actions. The actions which have been affected by the pandemic are highlighted at 2.4 in the report: hospital discharge procedures, shadowing opportunities, delivery of tenancy-ready training within the prison system, and there's an update on each of those actions and the issues within the report. But just to summarise there, the issue with hospital discharge, and that's obviously around our delayed transfers of care, our DTOC from our hospitals. We have had some resourcing issues. Staff shadowing is an obvious one in terms of those opportunities being very limited, particularly as staff have been required to work from home. And finally, delivery of tenancy-ready training within the prison system, which we were working closely with Welsh Government to look to pilot with Cardiff a tenancy-ready training, the idea being that we wanted as many prison leavers to sustain their tenancies as possible. But as you can see from the appendices, the update for in the appendix for AO10, you can see that the Justice Service have commenced their own tenancy sustainability activity and felt that it would be a duplication of effort. So we will keep a watching brief on that. Clearly, we want to ensure that that works, and if the prison system can deliver that, then that's fine. But otherwise, as I say, if we do find that prisoners, ex-prisoners, are having issues in sustaining tenancies, obviously we'll revisit that. Just in terms of some statistics, since March 2020, we've had over 5,000 homelessness inquiries. We've placed over 1,000 people in temporary accommodation. And as members will be aware, we currently average around 100 households currently in our bed and breakfast hotel units, and approximately a further 127 in other forms of temporary accommodation. And again, what we've identified is, in terms of those that are occupying our hotel accommodation particularly, which is obviously the excess accommodation that we were required to procure at the start of the pandemic, given the statutory basis that all local authorities in Wales were required to accommodate anyone effectively that was homeless or street homeless, regardless of vulnerability or priority need. As you can see from that, over half of the cohort are under the age of 35, and members will be aware that the local authority has extremely low numbers of single-roomed accommodation, one-bed accommodation for single people, and therefore the difficulties we have going forward in terms of move-on accommodation. We also in the report highlight the fact that the private rented sector, or our ability to discharge the private rented sector, continues to prove challenging. And we've undertaken some recent work with a social media survey and promotional initiatives to try and understand where our local landlords are in terms of their ability to assist us going forward, but their longer term aspirations in relation to continuing to wish to rent their properties. At 2.9, it gives you an update in terms of some of those issues that private landlords perhaps find challenging and are making them think twice around renting in the sector. As we know, court possession proceedings can now continue, but cases are prioritised for serious cases of antisocial behaviour and domestic violence. 6 months notice periods are still required by all landlords, required to end tenancies for all landlords, and that's been extended to the spring of 2022 under it mentions a likely legislative change. That change has now happened. There were some measures introduced by Welsh Government during the course of the last 16 months. Initially, a grant scheme whereby people could apply for a grant or a loan to help with difficulties in paying their rent. That scheme was not particularly well supported by residents who didn't wish to partake in loans, and that was replaced. Welsh Government introduced a grant scheme for allowing persons who were working to apply for financial support, but it was only for those people that were working. It didn't cover people on housing benefit or not in work. But as we indicate there, to date, no eligible claims have actually been processed. The arrears, the number of stipulations on that scheme, the arrears have to be directly attributed to a COVID-related issue. But as I say, to date, there's been certainly in the Vale no take-up and limited take-up, as far as I'm aware, across Wales. But as we know, for housing benefit discretionary payments, it remains the route for many who are renting and are not in employment. We note there that we've had some issues with some of our landlords who insist on 6 months rent in advance, but also now insisting on guarantors, even with cases that we support through the Vale Assisted Tenancy Scheme. We believe that obviously to be a direct result of the increase in notice periods and what landlords perceive as the additional risk of having to deal with tenancies which fail. We go on to indicate in the report that this committee's task and finish group are well advanced now in terms of hearing evidence and information in relation to the challenges that the council is facing as a result of recovering from the pandemic in terms of its housing issues. Areas that have been considered by a task and finish group at the moment include our policies and provision, discussions around allocation priorities, emerging legislation, funding challenges, and I would expect, well, as I understand, Scrutiny Committee Task and Finish Group will probably be looking to make some recommendations for Cabinet to consider in the next 4 or 5 months. I don't intend to take you through the action plan in detail, but if I can just draw your attention to some of the key areas of activity that we've been undertaking in the last period. A new IT system is currently being procured and is out to tender, which will obviously assist us in terms of the way that we respond to our tenants and residents. We obviously, in terms of statistical information, one of the major outcomes that we measure homeless prevention, and clearly that's been a challenge over the last 12 months, as everyone is now effectively in priority need during the current pandemic. I mentioned hospital discharge earlier. We continue to operate our multi-agency coordination cell meetings, which are working extremely well, which aim to support our residents who are currently in temporary accommodation, and also to support those agencies who are providing services. And we continue, as I say, to have good, close relationships with them. We've recommissioned most of our housing supports grant services in the last few months. 10 of our services have been recommissioned, which has allowed us to adapt the way we deliver our services, given the current situation we find ourselves in, but also it allows us to be more flexible in our approach in terms of the type of support that we can provide. And just a note there that we've got a number of new projects that we're looking to commission in the next 12 months, included a supported accommodation for people with complex needs. And I'm picking up on one of the points that Paula made in an earlier report around accommodation provision for young people. We're also working with social services to develop and deliver a supported accommodation unit, particularly for young people with complex needs. We also talk about the changes in terms of European Union, and of course that impacts on us in terms of what our EU residents' access to services. The other issues we've talked about, social media. I mentioned violence against women, domestic abuse and sexual violence. There is a report coming to your next scrutiny committee, which will elaborate a lot more on some of the discussions that you've had this evening in relation to that. And I think I'll probably leave it there. There are other areas that members may wish to ask questions on, but as I say, I'm happy to take questions. I think, as I say, the only overriding factor which I would obviously draw to members' attention is the issues are continuing. We continue to have homelessness, and whilst I mentioned earlier we have limited move-on accommodation, existing move-on accommodation, we're working extremely hard with our RSL partners, our private sector landlords, to try and develop alternative single persons accommodation. That does have challenges. However, as I say, the additional money that was made available through the housing support grant is helping us to try and create more sustainable opportunities and options for people. But as I say, as things stand, the work of the Task and Finish Group will be important, I think, in terms of making some recommendations and observations to Cabinet in the way that we currently allocate our properties going forward, to try and assist us in, as I say, when if and when funding for the hotels comes to an end, which is envisaged at the moment at the end of March. Thanks very much. Happy to take questions.
Thank you for that, Mike. It was very informative. We do have 3 people wishing to ask questions. The first being Councillor Sandra Perks, then Bronwyn Brooks, then Rachel Nugent-Finn. So if you'd like to go ahead, please, Councillor Perks.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Mike, for that report. As the chair of the Task and Finish Group, I must say that I think all the members have found it sort of very interesting to, sort of discuss and sort of investigate the various aspects that contribute to homelessness, also to meet the various partners who actually support the Vale, all the work that the officers do to try and, support people who are in perhaps going to be made homeless or are homeless and need to get into, you know, sort of back into the homes and stuff like that. So we're looking forward to finishing the report and providing that for Cabinet. I did have a question that I wanted to ask you. I just wondered if with the training for the actual tenancy with prisoners and stuff like that, with this course, is there the ability for sort of housing officers in the Vale to actually go in and meet the people who could be the prospective tenants of the Vale of Glamorgan, to start to build that relationship before they actually get into the Vale and before they're housed? I wondered if that goes on already, or whether that's something that would be you would be able to do.
Yeah, that was the intention of the pilot with Cardiff, that we would actually be delivering directly the tenancy ready service. I think there were two issues. One was obviously given lockdown and the social distancing measures, that sort of was delayed. The pilot was delayed, and subsequently, I think the justice system have obviously responded to the changing landscape and have introduced their own tenancy sustainability service. Now, hopefully that will work, but time will tell. As I mentioned in an earlier response, we clearly continue to wish to liaise closely with probation and with the prison service, and we do, and have done through the coordination cell, in terms of looking at issues such as risk, access to services, assessments in terms of needs, whether there be other issues that those ex-prison leavers will require in terms of mental health or drugs or alcohol support. So we are it wasn't the intention that we would have that type of service where we would go into the prison specifically and provide direct services. And as I say, it may be something that we will return to at a later date.
Okay, thank you. Chair, is it all right if I just ask Mike one other question that's pertinent to what he's just talked about? Yes, okay. So talking about risk and things like that, would you be able to sort of talk around a little bit around risk when people who've left prison are actually perhaps moved into a house of multiple occupation, and the different sort of risk assessment that's taken before they're actually placed in there, so that they, you know, sort of within the community, the support that they get and things like that as well, please, Mike?
Yeah, so we're provided with a completed risk assessment from either probation or the prison service, depending on how that individual is coming into service, which obviously highlights any particular issues. For cases where it would be subject to high risk, and what I mean by that are the anachronism is MAPA cases, multi-agency public protection arrangements. There would be a higher level of risk assessment undertaken in those circumstances because of the level of risk that had been identified. Now, clearly, the council has statutory responsibilities for all homeless people, whether they are identified with high, medium or low risk. And what we would then do is to work with partner agencies to assess the appropriateness of the accommodation. So, for example, we've been doing that through the last 14 months or so with our hotel accommodation. So, for example, we have over 100 people over 3 hotels. And clearly we need to ensure that we obviously properly consider the risks of placing people in that type of accommodation. So, for example, in relation to domestic abuse or domestic violence, clearly if we have a resident who is located in one of our hotels or a number of residents that may have been subject to that, clearly we wouldn't want to place an abuser in the same accommodation setting. So we do take that into account. In terms of housing multiple occupation, I would hazard a guess that the majority of those residents would be identified as low risk, given the sharing nature of the accommodation. However, we have had situations where those individuals have caused issues or may have caused problems within the accommodation, and we work then with the landlord to resolve those. And occasionally we will move individuals from one setting to another that is more appropriate based on the issue at hand. In some circumstances, that in extreme circumstances, that could be eviction as well, because obviously there are certain behaviours that wouldn't be acceptable in any setting. So there are appropriate risk assessments in place. We also undertake risk assessments. Obviously, we have a responsibility for our staff and for those agencies that would be supporting, particularly those people in the supporting third sector, perhaps in the supporting people service, and we share that information widely. So there would be appropriate risk assessment in place. I suppose in summary, we would consider appropriateness of setting based on the understanding and the individuals that we're placing.
Thank you very much, Mike, for that comprehensive reply. That's really good to hear. Thank you. Thank you, Millie, for letting me ask that other question.
That's okay. Unfortunately, my mouse pad wouldn't respond, so I've had to get my mouse out. I couldn't take myself off mute. I have managed to do it now. I've put my wired mouse in, my USB mouse in. Councillor Brooks, if you'd like to go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Thanks, Mike. That's a really valuable update to the strategy, and I'm really sort of pleased to see the amount of work that's still going on around this hugely important piece of work, as well as how the task and finish group will feed into that. I've got a couple of questions. That's all right, Chair. The first one is a concern I've seen lately. There seems to be a bit of a growing trend within the council on the planning. I know you can't comment on planning, but for people objecting and even trying to refuse social housing, there seems to be a growing trend around that, and that concerns me about the potential impact that if that happens on what happens now with our strategy and around all the people that we've got homeless in the Vale. So that really does concern me. The other question is I know we've got lots of money advisors and we'll talk about sustainable tenancies, but obviously we've got the £20 cut in universal credit has just been introduced, and also then people facing rising bills now over the winter with energy and food prices and everything like that. So it's around what sort of work are we doing to try and support those to make sure that we do try and keep sustainable tenancies, and the huge amount of work that our officers have done around that. Thank you, Chair.
If I come to the first question, you're right. I've been aware through social media of comments and commentary in relation to some of our developments and our proposed developments going forward. The one thing I would reflect on is that we have undertaken consultation with affected communities or communities who believe they will be affected by our proposals in a number of locations more recently, and I suppose none more so than perhaps the Court Road development, where there was certainly a high level of suspicion, opposition, to the development there. Now we obviously look to resolve that by communicating with nearby residents, and I know officers contacted I forget the name of the street that's nearby there at the back of Court Road, where we consulted with residents who had raised some concerns or issues, and what we've found is by addressing those individually with people, that has a lot more success. I think it's very difficult to be involved in social media debates because you will always have extremes or polarized views on either side of the argument. But I'm very clear. We've got over 6,000 people of our local residents who are in extreme housing need, who are looking for accommodation. most of I always find it interesting that most of the contributors to those discussions probably have family and friends who are probably on the council's housing waiting list, and if not now, maybe in the future, given that affordable accommodation, given the high price of housing in the Vale, a lot of those people will find that they need some form of, as I say, affordable option, going forward. So I think what we've looked at internally is how do we provide that positive message in terms of what we're doing. We're providing higher quality accommodation than the private sector, I would argue. It's more energy efficient than the private sector. We are providing over £3 million worth of housing related support across the Vale of Glamorgan to support tenants to sustain tenancies. We undertake tenancy ready training for some of the new tenants that come into the stock to remind them of their rights and responsibilities. And as I say, where the tenancy fails, we will work to try and save that tenancy, but ultimately if it does fail, we will take the responsible action necessary. So I think it is disappointing. It is disappointing people perhaps have misconceptions of what social housing is like now. We're talking around relatively small developments in comparison to the larger council estates that were built in the 30s, 40s and 50s. We very much target, and we have local lettings policies and lettings plans for some of those new build accommodation. So, for example, in the rural areas, we concentrate on people who are local to the accommodation that we're building. And as I say, we're happy to have a conversation or discussion with anyone about our developments. And as I say, I think that's probably where we've seen. It's always difficult, isn't it, with hearts and minds and trying to convince people. But as I say, I think we talk people through the projects we have, and we give assurances. And if things go wrong, if we give people the information on how to let us know about that, then we can try and resolve those issues. In terms of your second point, I'm mindful that going back to when the welfare reforms were introduced, this council took a view, which is still the case, that we would not evict anyone that was subject to a welfare benefit change. And I know that was some years ago, but that still holds true. So as far as we acknowledge that the removal of the £20 uplift will have caused people and will continue to cause people difficulty, as well as those issues around fuel poverty, which we know are going to affect an awful lot of people this winter, those people in work and not in work. So we continue to maximise income. We are through our money advice service. As members will be aware, I don't think we've provided, given where we've been for the last 15, 16 months, and a requirement to provide accommodation and to continue to provide ongoing accommodation. Evictions were very few and far between anyway. This authority would, it would be extremely last resort for us to consider eviction, and particularly for rent arrears. And we had great success, one of the most successful local authorities in Wales in terms of our arrears levels and working with our residents. So in answer to your question, we are equally concerned, but I'm also mindful that the service and the council, where there are changes to people's welfare benefits and the universal credit changes, we still have a position where we will not evict somebody that is where the arrears are as a direct result of a change.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I'm quite reassured to hear that. Yeah, as I said, it was the policy that we brought in around when the bedroom tax was brought in. So, you know, it's great, and it's thankfully it's down to the work that officers have done, or the hard work that they've done around that. Yeah, we've got very few evictions compared to other authorities. So thank you all for that, and I'm pleased that support, well, it's going to be needed now more than ever now. So thank you.
Okay, Councillor Nugent-Finn, did you want to come in?
I did, thank you, Chair, if that's okay. Thank you, Mike, as always, for all of the explanations. They're spot on. I can't ever fault you, honestly. It's really helpful. You mentioned, you know, certain interventions, the hospital discharge, the prison tenancy ready services. Is there anything specific for veterans, Mike?
Yes, we work very closely with colleagues. You'll remind me Abby's surname because it's gone Abby, our officer, our liaison officer.
Forces Fitness, yeah.
Yeah. And we do provide, legislation requires us to provide services to armed forces personnel. And we do so and are prioritised within our allocation policy and our allocation scheme.
Yeah.
We obviously work, as I say, very closely with the team there and with our housing related support providers. So where armed forces personnel, when assessed, identify with certain issues, obviously we can work with our housing related support providers to provide additional support for those. Clearly, we're also aware and signposts, and Abby signposts to a number of other statutory services and agencies that provide bespoke support to our armed forces personnel.
Okay.
One of the things I would say is anyone from whatever their housing need arises from, unfortunately at the moment we don't have enough accommodation to provide accommodation as quickly perhaps as everyone might like. And that is the same for those who have served in the armed forces as well. And as I say, we are continuing to work with agencies to look at opportunities perhaps in terms of bespoke supported accommodation going forward.
Yeah, understood. I mean, it's a very much a needs-led service, isn't it? And then you obviously would broker in whatever support's needed for that individual or family. Lovely. I'm just glad they're included in part of this new this package because, you know, they're a huge section of our society, aren't they? Especially given, you know, perhaps returning from Afghanistan. I tabled a question at full council to the cabinet member about our position with regards to Afghanistan and the refugee rehousing. She said that we're going to be working with 2 families. Where are we with that, Mike? Is that actually now in fruition, or are we still awaiting allocation or a request?
So you're quite right. The cabinet member was correct. The offer from the Vale of Glamorgan is 2 families at this time. We have 1 accommodation unit available, and we have another one that is potentially going to be available in the next few weeks.
Okay.
What happens is that, and I'm not sure if members necessarily are cited on this, those Afghan families that have come through and have spent their 10 days isolating, obviously in the hotels, are now moved out of those hotels and are accommodated in accommodation all over the country. We have 2 sites in Cardiff where those families are currently resident. And Cardiff Council are coordinating that interim accommodation for the whole of Wales. What will happen is that the working group who are overseeing that, together with colleagues in the Home Office, will then identify appropriate and suitable families for the accommodation that has been made available, the offers. So we are currently aware of 1 family who are likely to be directed to the accommodation that we have, and we have the other accommodation in the pipeline. I would hope that we will have accommodated both of those families by Christmas.
Fantastic, that's great. We did such a fantastic example with the Syrian refugees, so I would presume and hope that it follows on suit from that very successful outcome, Mike. That's really encouraging. Thanks for that.
Yeah, I would just comment and just add. Obviously, we're looking at the first phase of families that came through. There's a commitment from UK government that there are two schemes. There are obviously those that were providing support and translation skills to the armed forces. And then obviously there was the humanitarian assistance that also has been afforded to vulnerable groups, women, children. It's envisaged that there would be 5,000 individuals under the cohort that were providing advice and guidance, and up to 20,000 a commitment from UK government for a further 20,000 then over the next 3 years. So there will be potential, well, there will clearly be a requirement to reconsider and review that situation across the country in the coming years. What I would say is accommodation is in short supply, and that would be one of the issues that we as a local authority continue to face going forward. Because
absolutely, Mike. Yeah. I mean, I followed it up with a question of, well, how does this impact on our existing overstretched, vulnerable families on the waiting list, etc. It's huge. So I cared about every aspect of that impact, but also our responsibility. So watch this space.
Yeah, and I think it is worth pointing out that we are working with the private rented sector to provide accommodation. We are not at this stage providing council accommodation direct to those that are resettling. Okay.
Lovely. Thanks, Mike. The shortage of the one-bed properties, this was massively high on the agenda of the LDP, wasn't it? I mean, that was a huge part of the agreed LDP. So do we know how many's built so far, or is that more, should I hedge that more towards planning?
I mean, in terms of the LDP, clearly that would be that might be private housing as well as social housing.
Yeah.
I can tell you from a local authority housing perspective that the one-bed accommodation, new build accommodation that has been built and is continuing to be built is because we prioritise that in our discussions with our RSL partners. So, for example, the next big scheme that will come online will be that at Subway Road. And that will be a huge help to us as a local authority in terms of a number of priority need cases that we have. We also require, on mixed developments, we require a percentage of one-bedroomed accommodation, and we obviously, as a council, we provide one-bedroomed accommodation on our mixed units, mixed accommodation units as well. In terms of the numbers and achieving, we will never achieve the amount of building that would be required to meet our numbers in the LDP.
I totally agree.
It's more aspirational than not. But as I say, it informs us in terms of where the priorities should be.
Understood. I'm really pleased as well to say that all of the support workers are still going into the hostel and hotel accommodation, Mike. It's every other week, perhaps sometimes.
Excuse me, Heather, could you please mute yourself?
If I can now, thank you.
It's really encouraging, Mike, to know that the very people that need the support are still getting the support in the hotel accommodation. I'm working with a family at the minute, and a few emails and calls, and it's it was next day sort of response, which is really helpful because it's just what's needed. Again, at the most vulnerable time, it's some of it's quite crisis, firefighting, and it's all going on, isn't it? But that's really. I'm so pleased that that's happening, Mike. So huge thanks to the support housing team for that. I'm disappointed that, you know, Welsh Government didn't target the people, again, who needed the grant most. You know, we could have really done with that. Certainly some of the families I'm working with, but there you go. And just to round up on social housing misconception, as an elected member, I take every single opportunity to challenge, that sounds, you know, but in a positive way, to educate and to draw parallels and you know, sort of help public to understand why this exists, you know. And I use this term, well, once upon a time your house wasn't here, and your house went through this process, planning and everything else. So as you quite rightly said, Mike, if you explain to people on perhaps an individual basis or you know, in a cluster of people, it's definitely, the message is getting through. But as an elected member, I take every opportunity to reassure people that social housing is now part of our demographic. It's part of every new build, etc., etc. So I just want you to know that I am fully supportive of that. Okay, that's it from me. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mike.
Okay, nobody else seems to have any questions. So the recommendations on this. Yes, that is a good point in the chat. I don't know if everybody has seen this, but in future, are we able to please just keep questions and not long statements? It does take up time. Thank you. The recommendations on this is that the Homes and Safe Communities Scrutiny Committee continue to examine the progress to date in implementing the Homelessness Prevention Strategy and Action Plan in Appendix 1, and that we consider the additional actions included and the significant pressures on the service, its staff and resources as a result of the COVID pandemic. Are we happy with that report?
Happy with the report.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes,
Sorry, what was that?
No, yes, just agreeing with the report.
Okay, thank you. I do apologise. My headset started cutting out in the middle of that. I've had to unplug it, so I did lose some of that, but most of it was very what I heard was very informative and very, very detailed. So thank you very much. The next item is agenda item 8, report of the Managing Director. It is the second quarterly scrutiny recommendation tracking 2021 and 22 and updated community forward work programme schedule 2021 to 2022. I am going to pass you over to Mark for this, as he is much more knowledgeable and knows much more of the nitty-gritty than I do on this. So I shall pass you over to him and he will take us through it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. Hope committee can hear me okay. This is our quarterly regular report, reporting on the progress of scrutiny recommendations and to consider the updated forward work programme together with any slippage for the 2021-22 period. This report obviously advises members on the progress in relation to the Scrutiny Committee's historical recommendations and his updated forward work programme schedule for 21-22, including the report for the committee's consideration. At Appendix A is the second quarter recommendation tracking, which was for July to September 2021. Appendix B, first quarter recommendation tracking April to June 2021, Appendix B, and Appendix C, the 2019 to 20 uncompleted recommendation tracking. We also then have at Appendix D, the updated committee forward work programme schedule for 21-22 period. The key recommendations here is that the status of the actions listed in Appendices A to C to the report be agreed, and also that the updated committee forward work programme be considered for approval and uploaded to the council's website. I will just take members through some of the appendices, in particular the incomplete sort of recommendations that we've had at previous meetings. And what I'll probably do is ask if Mike can to update on some of those recommendations we still sort of have as ongoing. So
if I refer members, I think to Appendix B first. This was the update on the dark service. The recommendation that the dark service have greater engagement with support groups concerning domestic abuse. I just wonder, Mike, if you would be able to provide any sort of further updates, if there's been any progress in terms of that sort of recommendation, please.
Yeah, just very quickly, I know this was a matter raised by a number of members at a previous committee, and as a result of which I know the issue of peer support has been provisionally discussed with Julie Grady and Deb Gibbs within the community safety team. And it's an area that the service will continue to look at and to identify and support peer support opportunities.
Okay, thanks for that, Mike. Chair, if you're happy, I'll move on to the next appendix, which is Appendix C. And at the moment, we have, in terms of an ongoing recommendation here, is obviously the ongoing follow-up from the report that identifying appropriate housing solution for the traveller community, which has obviously come back to us and then gone on to Cabinet, etc. Mike, I know obviously it's a bit of an ongoing matter really in terms of review, but I just wonder if there was any additional updates for committee to be aware of.
No specific detail other than officers within planning and property services continue to try and source alternative land opportunities for potential sites. In terms of the second recommendation in the report regarding options appraisal, that work has been delayed to a certain extent because of other priorities, specifically in relation to the work that we were doing with providing accommodation for those homeless individuals from our bed and breakfast and our hostels, and trying to identify an alternative housing solutions for those. But work is continuing and ongoing. I can also advise, although not necessarily directly relevant to identifying alternative provision, that the council is required to undertake its new Gypsy Traveller assessment and is required to provide that to Welsh Government by February 2022, next February. And we have commissioned Opinion Research Services, ORS, to undertake that survey work for us. They've recently been commissioned, and individual members of the council and members of this committee will be consulted individually and collectively in relation to Gypsy and Traveller provision in the Vale. There is a steering group that will be set up, an internal steering group to work with the consultants, which will include representatives from the Education Service, Social Services, Police, the Gypsy and Traveller community themselves, as well as other stakeholders. And as I say, that piece of work will start in the next few weeks, and members will be consulted directly.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay, just to finish off, Chair, obviously then we've got the Appendix D, which is the updated 2021-22 work programme. Essentially, the majority of the reports that we were expected have been undertaken during the quarter, although there has been some instances of slippage, which are noted on the table and in the report. I think that's really just a bit of a whistle-stop tour through those. Obviously, if yourself, Chair, or committee have any questions, myself or Mike should be able to address most of them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mike. I have to admit, I am quite happy with this. If anybody else has any questions, please let me know. Okay, I can't see anybody's hands up. So I will ask regarding the recommendations. Now, recommendation 1 is that the status the status of the actions listed in appendices A to C of the report be agreed. Are we happy to agree that?
Agreed.
Yes,
Yes,
Chair.
Chair.
Yes, Chair. Yeah.
Thank you. And the second recommendation is that the updated committee forward work programme schedule attached to Appendix D be considered for approval and uploaded to the council's website. Are we happy to approve that and have that uploaded?
Approved.
Yes, Chair.
Yes, Chair.
Okay, thank you. So the next thing I have to say is that I have no other matters, nothing that I've declared urgent. So I just want to say thank you very much for coming. And I hope Mr. Hennessy and Ms. John enjoyed their first meeting, and we haven't scared them off yet. So we will see you all again next meeting, which is on the 10th of November at 6 p.m, Wednesday the 10th. Okay. Thank you very much for coming. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. I'm sticking on my